So we're going to go through some questions first, and then we'll do 2 practices together as always. So I'm going to start ticking through the questions. The first question is, would you share your supplement plan with us? And I would be happy to. So first I will say that, you know, anything that DCIM recommends in the vitamin, supplement, botanical realm that has to do with COVID is really based on biological plausibility. So the idea that we have data that these, you know, whether they're nutrients or botanicals, have an impact on viruses in a way that we think will be useful. And also that they are going to not cause harm, right? Because that's the last thing that we would ever want to do. So that's the rationale in coming up with an approach that we recommend. And I'm going to share mine, but one of the things that I will also say is you can really individualize this plan, right? So this is kind of like, and I'll explain what this line is, but this is what it looks like for me, for my like COVID part of the plan. I take vitamin C every day. I take 1,000 milligrams a day. And remember, vitamin C enhances the innate immune system. And that's part of the system that like looks around and says, oh, this is not good. Let me go catch this thing and make sure my body knows to get rid of it. I also take vitamin D. I take 2,000 IUs a day. But this is something that has a lot of flexibility because it depends a little bit about what your underlying status is and how much you might need. 2,000 a day is a pretty safe amount that most people can take, but I always recommend talk to your healthcare provider before you do anything. And then I take, and remember, vitamin D basically inhibits the entry of virus into the cell. And then I take zinc, 30 milligrams a day, and the picolinate form tends to be the gentlest on your belly. So that's the form that I take. And zinc is, you know, been shown to be a pretty big player as this kind of unfolds in the virus. So I would say an important one. And yet at the same time, zinc and copper, which is another nutrient, exist in a pretty tight ratio with each other. So I wouldn't go bananas on zinc without talking to your healthcare provider about how much and how much would be ideal for you. But I do take zinc a day. Zinc every day, and it inhibits the replication of virus, okay? So that's why it's useful. Here are the 2 things that are kind of like individualized to my plan, and I think it was 2 weeks ago that we talked about melatonin and how melatonin inhibits the NLPR3 inflammasome, which is just like a fancy way of saying it inhibits part of the response to COVID that tends to lead to poor outcomes, okay? And I don't think willy-nilly putting yourself on melatonin is necessarily good, although some doctors would recommend that. I started it because I started having trouble with sleeping a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, okay, I can get 2 benefits with one thing. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So I take a liposomal melatonin, 3 to 5 milligrams every night. And this last one is called quercetin. And it's a naturally occurring substance. And quercetin, if you're a Washingtonian and you haven't had allergies, then bless you, you are special. But this is usually something that's actually a natural kind of support for allergies. And I have had more allergies lately. And so I have leaned to using quercetin because quercetin has also like been a pretty cool player in all of this. One, quercetin inhibits viral entry into cells, and it also has the additional benefit of being what's called a zinc ionophore, which essentially means it just improves zinc in the cell. So it has like a double benefit on inhibiting viral replication, okay? So that's kind of what my regimen looks like now, although I will say, you know, when I go back into the office and see patients live, and that will probably happen before we kind of like are all interacting more loosey-goosey, I will ramp up my protocol and probably take more vitamin C and vitamin D and likely vitamin A and start taking my reishi mushroom tea more regularly. And so all of that is less to say that's what you should be doing, but more to say recognize that there are kind of sliding ways in which we deal with this depending on if you're prevention or if you're prevention plus exposure or if you're kind of active illness. And it's important to talk to your doctor wherever you are in that stage to come up with an individualized plan, okay? And then I will say on top of that, that I'm doing all of this in the context of making sure I get good sleep and with the aid of some help if I need it, but prioritizing my sleep every night, right? Like I have a shutdown window where I'm like, there's no work, there's no stress, there's no talking to my husband even about, stuff that means coordination, because it's just going to activate me. So there's a pretty strict like wind down time before I go to bed. I exercise every day, I meditate every day, and I'm pretty serious about what I eat. So I even kind of recommitted in the last 10 days and did what's called an elimination diet, where you remove foods that are potentially inflammatory. And I've done this before, but I kind of redid it to dairy recently because I was finding that like I wasn't feeling so great with dairy. And I took it out of my diet and kind of supported myself in this way. And I say all that to say, supplements are great, but you cannot supplement yourself out of a problem, right? It has to happen in the context, and you can't medicate yourself out of a problem either, for that matter. It has to happen in the context of like a larger approach that is thinking holistically about your body, in my opinion. So I think that covers that question. I'll move on to number two. Number two is, I read in the Washington Post that people are dying from strokes secondary to SARS-CoV-2. Is this true? Do you have thoughts about this? So obviously this is me kind of digging a little bit more into the literature and discussing with colleagues, because I'm not in the ICU, but there does seem to be a trend of more cardiac related deaths associated with COVID. So that would be stroke or heart attack, okay? And this is a little confusing considering we originally thought of this as a respiratory illness, right? And those are cardiac implications. And so as I've been digging into this, what I have found is that many researchers and frontline workers in the ICU who have been working with this much more closely, some would even go so far as to say that this virus really just uses the lungs as an entry point, but actually its main target or negative, outcome is associated with cardiac related issues. So I can try and explain that a little bit. There is a receptor called the ACE2 receptor, which you may have read about or heard about if you're listening to, podcasts or reading about this virus. And that receptor, without getting too in depth, it's just like, oh, look, this is on my desk. It's just like there's a bolt and a, this is like perfect. So it's just the way for the virus to enter the cell, right? It's like literally like just a little like receptor, and it's the way that the virus can enter a cell. But what's interesting is that that ACE2 receptor also exists, pretend this is a blood vessel. That ACE2 receptor also exists on the inside of the blood vessel. So that's called the endothelium. It exists on the endothelium of blood vessels. And kind of like we were talking about last week, where we talked about the lungs and gas exchange, if you just think about it, if you're trying to understand the connection, like obviously there is very close proximity between the lungs and your blood vessels because of what's happening with gas exchange there. So even just with that proximity, if we're thinking about it that way, that virus also now has a way to get into the blood vessels. And without going into the full picture of what happens biochemically, it's pretty complicated, but the end result essentially is when that ACE2 receptor, when he is inactivated, there are implications that essentially mean increased inflammation, increased oxidative stress. So that basically means free radical damage, tissue damage. It means vasoconstriction. So instead of the blood vessel being like, oh, it's so relaxed and open, it becomes really tight, right? So harder for blood to flow. And then there's also a pro-clotting mechanism that starts to run rampant when that ACE2 receptor is inactivated. So you can see how, it starts to make more sense how we're seeing kind of many implications of this virus because of all the different things that it can do. And like I said last week when I was talking about the virus, I know it is stressful to keep learning new things, but I also think it's encouraging for us to get closer and closer to mechanisms, because it will allow us to get better and better at treating. And at the same time, I also want to say that food and sleep and stress management and exercise all modulate inflammation and oxidative stress in the ways that we want them to. So these are really important tools. And I don't think just for COVID-19, but hopefully for us to all be inspired about as we move forward in our lives, and hopefully look at this one day as something in the distant past. I think that's all I have to say about that. So last question, are two kind of like meditation related questions. And the first one is, so the question is, can you kind of explain the difference between stress reduction and stress management? And so I would say, like, essentially it's semantics on some level. I think people use that phrase interchangeably. Obviously, I say stress reduction a lot, and that's just because like I was in medical school and studying this stuff at a time where the like formalized mindfulness-based stress reduction program was something that was being looked at regularly and studied all the time, and so that's just kind of in my brain. But if you think about it, stress reduction, saying it that way, may give you the false sense that it is something that just can be reduced and then is gone, and that's just not true, right? We all know that stress is something that is always there, and it shows up in different ways, and it comes and it goes, but it is not something that you can just like end at any point. So I think stress management has come into popularity because maybe it communicates something that is more accurate, which is that it is something that needs to be attended to and nurtured and cared for, and it's always there, and you do kind of have to manage it. So that would be my thought on that. And then a related question to meditation is, last week you spoke about the immune benefits of meditation and mindfulness. Can you speak to whether this is also true for more yogic practices of breathing, like pranayama breathing, alternate nostril breathing, hyperventilation practices? And regardless, which practice should I use given what's out there? This is a great question, and I have not done a crazy deep dive on it, but probably could and will in time. But I did spend some time on PubMed today to try and give you a good sense of an answer here. And what I will tell you is that I did find placebo-controlled studies looking at pranayama. So those are more breathing practices associated with a yoga practice. And there are quite a few of them, but those are the ones that are most typically have been born out of a yogic practice. And there are studies that show that it does have a significant difference on immune function. It enhances the innate immune system. It has alterations on T cells, which are part of the immune system. So yes, I do think that there is data out there. And interestingly, since I was there, there's also another big form of kind of breath practice, which is transcendental meditation, which is just a different type of meditation practice. And that too has a lot of good data about its benefits on the immune system. So there is stuff out there. There are no like head-to-head trials that I could find that would allow me to say, this is the one that I would really do. That being said, the most amount of data is available probably for mindfulness meditation. And that truthfully is partially because of like who started researching it and was capable of getting it into hospitals. And therefore, like many other people started doing, kind of clinical trials on it. And so there's a lot of stuff on that out there. And if you wanted to be motivated by, okay, what has the most amount of data out there? Yeah, that would be the answer. But it's a little bit, it's almost like, what we know about plant-based medicine. There's not a lot of studies on plant-based medicine because it wasn't as well known and there's not a lot of money in it, right? So those things make it complicated to say one is definitely better than the other, but if you want to be driven by data alone, mindfulness meditation does have the most out there. That being said, my personal take on this is that all of these practices that are kind of impacting breath and therefore having an impact on the body or acting through an immune neuroendocrine system. So kind of the interplay between those systems. And so really functionally, they're all just having a positive response on stress. And that's really the thing that causes a positive impact on the immune system. So my pragmatic advice would be whatever you're able to do regularly, because while meditation has like that affect benefit, like you feel kind of nice afterwards, the immune system benefits come more with a regular practice. So whatever of the practices you actually think, I'm into this enough that I will do this every day, that would be a good indicator for you. Or whatever one you actually just feel the most kind of relaxed with, like the one that you think like at the end of this, like I actually always feel nice, then that would be probably the one that I would choose for you. Okay, hopefully that was helpful, guys.